And we now come to the statement on Ukraine. Sir Andrew Mitchell.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. 2 years ago, we know that Putin thought his tanks would roll easily into Kyiv and Ukraine would fall within days. He did not expect Ukraine's brave resistance, he did not expect his military to let him down so badly, and he did not expect the West to stand so firmly in support with unprecedented sanctions and massive aid to Ukraine to help them resist. Today, Ukraine stands strongly and united, and the international community stands just as firmly in our support. Yet even now, Putin tries to pretend he is winning this illegal war, even though Ukraine has retaken half the territory seized in 2022 and largely pushed the Black Sea Fleet out of Crimea, even though he has failed in his attempts to stop Ukraine exporting grain, and even though, Mr. Deputy Speaker, his actions have united Europe, convincing Sweden and Finland to join NATO and the EU to begin accession talks with Ukraine. It speaks volumes, Mr. Deputy Speaker, about this neo-imperialist bully that he still stubbornly continues despite the cost to Ukraine and his own people. In recent months, Putin sent around 50,000 young Russians to their deaths to take Advika, a town whose pre-war population was just 35,000. We must and will ensure he fails, for this is the biggest test of our generation. Putin's brazen violation of the UN Charter strikes at the heart of the rules on which our security and prosperity depend. And our adversaries, Mr. Deputy Speaker, are watching. Today, we stand at a critical junction. Putin should be in no doubt of where we stand or of our resolve. This is why last Thursday, on the 22nd of February, we announced over 50 new sanctions targeting those supporting his war effort. That includes arms manufacturers, electronics companies, and diamond and oil traders sustaining Putin's illegal war. It brings the total number sanctioned under our Russia regime to 2,000, including banks accounting for more than 90% of the Russian banking sector. Not to mention more than 130 oligarchs who were together worth around £147 billion at the time of the invasion. Last month in Kyiv, Mr. Deputy Speaker, the Prime Minister and President Zelensky signed a new agreement building Ukraine's military capabilities and announcing a new wide-ranging partnership, an unbreakable alliance to last 100 years or more. It includes our new £2.5 billion military support package, of which at least £200 million will be spent on a major push to produce thousands of military drones for Ukraine, including surveillance, long-range strike and sea drones. Britain was the first country to sign a long-term bilateral security agreement with Ukraine, as we promised in Vilnius. France, Germany, Italy, Denmark and Canada have now followed suit. Last week, we witnessed time and again how we and our allies share the same conviction, the same determination that Ukraine will prevail. At the Munich Security Conference, the Foreign Secretary made the case for a major uplift in European defence production so Ukraine gets all the firepower and equipment necessary to prevail. At the G20, Mr. Deputy Speaker, Foreign Ministers meeting, it was clear there are few illusions about what Russia is doing. And at the UN, Britain underlined how dangerous Putin's actions are for the entire world. In a call to mark the second anniversary of Putin's barbaric invasion, G7 leaders held a joint call with President Zelensky to mark the second anniversary, renewing our pledge to make Russia pay. And on Monday evening in Paris, the Foreign Secretary urged European partners to do more to show Putin that we will not let him win. All these efforts, Mr. Deputy Speaker, are having a real impact. The European Union has agreed a €50 billion multi-year funding package. Germany has doubled its military aid. And in the coming weeks, we expect several more of our partners to sign bilateral security agreements with Ukraine. And we will keep up and step up the pressure. And there is more we can do. That means ensuring we use sanctions to stop businesses funding Putin's war machine and engaging other countries to do the same. Pursuing all lawful routes to use sanctioned Russian assets across the G7 to support Ukraine, and working with partners to achieve this. And with our partners, giving Ukraine more of the munitions and equipment which will make the biggest difference. More ammunition, and more ammunition at speed. More simple-to-use weapon systems like drones and Soviet-era kit. More support, including through training on F-16s. And more of the systems which have the biggest strategic impact, like Storm Shadow long-range missiles. Through all this, Mr. Deputy Speaker, we are sending an unambiguous message of our enduring support for Ukraine. A message writ large in blue and yellow last Saturday when we projected the words Slava Ukraini onto government buildings up and down the land and our embassies worldwide, telling Ukraine, her people and the world that the United Kingdom, our allies and people, are here for them for as long as it takes. I cannot end, Mr. Deputy Speaker, without acknowledging the terrible impact of Putin's despotism on ordinary Russians as well. More than 300,000 Russian soldiers have been killed or wounded in Ukraine, many more than in the decade-long Soviet occupation of Afghanistan. The war is robbing Russians of resources that should be spent on pensions or teachers. Indeed, Putin's Kremlin has systemically repressed the freedoms of its own people over the last 2 decades. We saw this most recently and tragically in the death of Alexei Navalny earlier this month, a man who fought with incredible courage to expose corruption throughout his life, calling for free and fair politics and holding the Kremlin to account. The British government is calling for a full and transparent investigation into the circumstances of his death, and the Prime Minister has emphasised we hold the Russian state accountable for its role in his death. We immediately announced sanctions against 6 individuals heading up the penal colony where Mr. Navalny died, following years of mistreatment at the hands of the Russian state. Britain was the first nation to introduce sanctions in response to Mr. Navalny's death, and we are working with international partners to coordinate the next steps. Let me end by reiterating the UK's call for Russia to release all those imprisoned on political grounds, including dual British-Russian national Vladimir Kara-Murza, who is serving a 25-year sentence. The Foreign Secretary will meet his wife and his mother on Friday to express our solidarity and support. And as the Foreign Secretary stated in New York, Putin tries to portray this as a battle between Russia and the West. That is the central lie, Mr. Deputy Speaker, of this war. Our quarrel is not with the Russian people. Our dispute is with those within the Russian state, promoting their aggressive agenda at home and abroad to serve their own personal interests. Britain stands with all those who have fallen victim to Putin's aggression and cruelty in Ukraine and in Russia. I commend, Mr. Deputy Speaker, this statement to the House.
David Lammy.
Well, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I thank the Minister for advance sight of his statement. But once again, the Shadow Cabinet Minister for International Development is updating the House on one of the most important foreign policy issues of our time. I ask him again, as yesterday, I didn't get a clear answer then, when will the Foreign Secretary take questions from members on all sides of this House? Mr. Deputy Speaker, last week marked 2 years since the start of Putin's full-scale illegal invasion of Ukraine. The bombed-out cities, the raped civilians, and the children kidnapped to Russia show the barbarity of Putin's rogue regime. Ukraine's resilience in the face of hell is testament to their enormous courage. We echo the Minister's statement that Ukraine's actions to retake half the territory seized in 2022, pushing back the Black Sea fleets and the unity that Europe has show Putin's attempt to show Russia is winning this war is just a pretense. But we cannot be complacent. It requires our support to Ukraine to remain just as strong. Labour's message to Ukraine is simple. Whoever is in government, Britain will support Ukraine until it prevails. Mr. Deputy Speaker, we support the further and significant military financial support the Conservative government has announced, as well as further sanctions. Britain is united on Ukraine, but it is our job as the official opposition to highlight where we think there's more that can be done. We commend South Korea for sending more shells to Ukraine than all of Europe combined. But this war has to be a wake-up call to all of Europe. There is more we, along with our allies, must do together. We welcome the French President bringing world leaders together this week. And it is in this spirit that Labour has outlined plans for a new UK-EU security pact to complement NATO's ties and strengthen our whole continent. Can I ask the Minister what his government is doing to work more closely with the European Union on our collective security, and whether the Foreign Secretary would attend Foreign Affairs Councils of the European Union if invited to do so? Labour warmly welcomes Sweden's accession to NATO. It strengthens our whole alliance. But what recent conversations has the Foreign Secretary had with NATO's counterparts regarding a pathway for Ukraine's membership? More sanctions are welcome, but enforcement remains the weak link. Last December, an OFSI report showed that there had been zero enforcement measures for post-February 2022 sanction breaches in relation to Russia. Can the Minister confirm whether or not this is still the case? And can the Minister update the House on the effectiveness of sanctions being implemented against the Lukashenko regime in Belarus? Mr. Deputy Speaker, one man holds ultimate responsibility for the death of Alexei Navalny, and his name is Vladimir Putin. We welcome the sanctions against 6 individuals the UK announced in the wake of his death, but this is not enough. Why won't this government commit to reviewing sanctions on Russia, considering every individual on the full Navalny list? Why won't this government back Labour's calls to support a new international anti-corruption court? And why won't this government back Labour's whistleblower reward scheme to crack down on enablers? And following the European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen's positive statement today and the passing of 250 days since Labour's motion to require the government to bring forward legislation to ensure the seizure and repurposing of Russian state assets, why won't this government finally turn rhetoric on seizure into action? Finally, I'd like to welcome the government highlighting Vladimir Kara-Murza's case. Tomorrow, I too will meet with his wife, Evgeny Kara-Murza. Over the weekend, there were reports of members of Parliament in this House concerned this government was not taking the lead on efforts to secure his release from Russian prison. Can the Minister reassure us by outlining the strategy and steps ministers are now taking before it's too late? I'm grateful, Mr. Deputy.
Very much, Minister. Well, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I'm very grateful to the honourable gentleman for the cross-party support which he is giving to what I said today. He's quite right to ask piercing questions, of course, but the fact remains that the House is united on this issue, and it means that Britain speaks with one voice and with great effectiveness. He once again chides me for not being the Foreign Secretary. I'm actually not, Mr. Deputy Speaker, the Shadow Cabinet Minister for Development. I think that is his honourable friend for Wigan who occupies that position. But he sees the Foreign Secretary often. I think he's about to see him again, and the Foreign Secretary is an ever-present presence in the House at both ends, and of course he will be available for questioning to members of this House in the way that has been discussed. He expressed very strong support for the further military provisions that we have supplied and the further sanctions. And he talked about the wake-up call for Europe, and I very much agree with him. He asked about our working with the European Union and with other European countries. He, like me, will have been delighted to see the 50 billion euros that the EU have allocated over the next 4 years for non-military activity, and there will be further announcements, we believe, in respect of military support. And also he will have seen that along with the £2.5 billion of military support announced by our Prime Minister, President Macron has announced a similar figure, and Germany has very significantly increased the amount of military support which it is providing for Ukraine. So I think there is clearly a great coordination and a rising recognition across Europe and throughout NATO that this is a struggle in which all of us are involved. He asked me, Mr. Deputy Speaker, about the effectiveness of sanctions, and I can tell him that now 2,000 people 2,000 entities have been sanctioned, 90% of the Russian banking sector. We will be introducing in the stepping up of sanctions, which all the time are developing an ability to sanction ships. And when it comes to inquiring about the effectiveness of sanctions, I would point out to him that Russia would have had an additional $400 billion without the sanctions which have been imposed, money to prosecute the war, which they do not now have. And last week, a Turkish company, 3 Chinese entities and 2 Belarus entities were sanctioned. Although, as I'm sure he would agree, we don't discuss the development of sanctions across the House, I can assure him that this is proving to be very effective and is denying the Russian war machine vital supplies.
Alicia Kearns.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Can I welcome the Deputy Foreign Secretary's focus on the progress that Ukraine has made against overwhelming odds in the face of one of the biggest militaries in the world. I have just returned from Ukraine with my honourable friend, and it was my honour whilst there to meet with some of the soldiers who were gravely injured last summer defending Avdiivka. And they shared stories about how those in their units who are still on the front line who've just had to withdraw were left bleeding out for 6 to 8 hours, sometimes more, because there is not enough ammunition to medevac those who have been hurt. What happened in Avdiivka should shame the international community and not Ukraine, because what they are doing is incredible. But there seems to be an issue globally where people forget that this isn't a Disney movie. The good guys don't just win. It is down to us to make sure that they have the tools to fight. And I have put proposals to the Defence Secretary over the weekend of where I believe we can obtain more ammunition. Bitterly, it is 80 years since the UK last went to the US to petition them to help defend security in Europe. We need now, and I urge the Deputy Foreign Secretary to help me advise, how the UK is battling some of the pernicious narratives that are arising. First, in the US, we see they are forgetting the threat of Putin. We must remind them that the threat of Putin is what they are ultimately fighting against. And secondly, in Europe, we see a pernicious narrative about how will the Baltics and the Nordics defend themselves in 2 or 3 years' time when Russia rebuilds itself. That cannot be the focus. We have to end Putin now. We have to stop the ability to invade Ukraine now. So what is my right honourable friend doing to fight these narratives now?
Minister.
Well, I thank the Chair of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee very much for her perceptive and wise comments. She is, of course, to take her last point first, absolutely right, that we are hoping that Congress will follow the setting in passing the relevant bills swiftly following their return from the recess there. And United States support is absolutely vital for Ukraine's success, as she so rightly says. And I'm very glad that she has been able to see for herself what is happening. Sometimes we understate the extent to which Putin is being beaten back. Although the Russian advance into Avdiivka did take place, those 2 kilometres cost between 40 and 50,000 Russian deaths. 1/5 of the Black Sea Fleet has been destroyed. Crimea is no longer safe for the Russian military to operate. And grain supplies are moving across the Black Sea. Revenues for Ukraine are at pre-conflict levels. And of course, unlike in year one, this winter the lights stayed on and the bombings by Russia were unable to achieve the same effect as they achieved before. This war is not affordable for Russia. 40% of government spending is now spent on the war, 6% of GDP. This is all in pursuit of the worst atrocities, Mr. Deputy Speaker, we have seen in Europe over the last 80 years. Unmatched. And it's important to point out, too, that Britain has not only supplied the £2.5 billion announced of military material announced by the Prime Minister to be supplied this year, but also has supplied 300,000 artillery shells. That is a measure, Mr. Deputy Speaker, of our determination to ensure that Ukraine has everything that we can offer them.
Brendan O'Hara.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I thank the Minister for a prior sight of his statement, and I want to put on record once again our steadfast and unyielding support for the people of Ukraine in defending themselves, their homes, their country from Putin's illegal, aggressive war. And I share the concerns expressed by the Chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee when she said that it appeared that Putin's plan was to keep this war going until Ukraine's democratic allies lose interest and somehow let support slip away. That simply cannot be allowed to happen. And speaking to colleagues who have just returned from Kyiv at events to mark the second anniversary of the war, their report is that this is a critical time for Ukraine, and Ukraine needs our help now every bit as much as it did on the day Putin attacked. So first and foremost, we must guard against complacency. We cannot let the Ukrainian people down simply because we lose interest, because if Ukraine loses, we all lose. And I very much welcome the UK Government's financial and military support package and the new €50 billion multi-year funding package from the European Union, and the fact that Germany has committed to doubling its military aid. And I share his hope that many of Ukraine's allies will now follow that lead, most notably the United States, whose prevarication has surely only emboldened Ukraine's enemies and depressed the Ukrainian people further. But there's still so much we can do. I take his point about the sanctions regime, but what about the frozen Russian assets being used to assist Putin's war victims, most notably the £2 billion that sits in a London bank 2 years on from the sale of Chelsea Football Club? But can I ask the Minister, as we look ahead, has the FCDO Atrocity Prevention Monitoring Body been keeping track of breaches of international law and war crimes being committed by Russia and Ukraine? And with a marked increase in the targeting of civilians in Kyiv, Odessa, Kharkiv and Lviv, can I ask, is the UK Government preparing a case for the International Criminal Court against Russia for the deliberate targeting and bombardment of civilians in Ukraine?
Minister.
Well, I want to thank the honourable gentleman for his supportive comments. As I said to the Shadow Foreign Secretary, the fact that the House speaks with one voice on this matter gives Britain much greater authority in the councils of the world. He warns against complacency, and I hope he will agree that Britain has shown no signs of backsliding on this. No country has done more than the UK. We were the first, Mr. Deputy Speaker, to supply tanks, long-range missiles, and we are assisting in the scouring of the world for old Soviet military stock, Soviet legacy stock, and Britain recently announced 200 million drones to be made both in the UK and in Ukraine. I can also tell him that the European Peace Facility, which will provide funding for the Ukraine armed forces, is progressing, and he will know that Britain and the Nordics together have set up the International Fund for Ukraine, which has now raised more than £1 billion. So I hope we can agree, I hope I can satisfy him that there is absolutely no complacency whatsoever. He asks me about the Chelsea Fund. I can tell him that there is immense frustration that the Chelsea Fund isn't out and operating at this time. We are doing everything we can within significant and irritating levels of difficulty to get it deployed, and we will do that as fast as we possibly can. And he ends his comments about war crimes, and the government, along with our allies, are doing everything we can to ensure that there is no question of Putin not being held to account when this dreadful conflict is over.
Dominic Raab.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. Can I welcome my right honourable friend's statement? In an interview this week, Ukraine's national security advisor warned that the Kremlin is better equipped than ever to disrupt elections using AI. Can the House get an update on the UK's readiness to deal with this kind of assault on our democracy?
Minister.
He makes a very good point, Mr Deputy Speaker, and my right honourable friend is right to flag up the deep concern that exists about that. I think it's not for me, Mr Deputy Speaker, to answer his specific point about the steps that the government is taking to protect us from that, but certainly there are other ministers more directly associated with that who will be able to give him a full update.
Then Bradshaw.
Notwithstanding his upbeat tone, in his response to the chair of the Select Committee, he did acknowledge that vital American support is still being held up in Congress because of Trump supporting Republicans. Does he agree with me that self-preening British politicians who fawn at Trump do nothing but give succour to Putin and his murderous regime?
Minister.
What I would say to the right honourable gentleman is that we are doing everything we can to ensure that we play our part in persuading our many friends in Congress to support this measure. He will have seen what the Foreign Secretary did when he was there. He may well have seen the very powerful article which was widely available in the United States, and I hope he will conclude from that that we are doing everything we can to pursue the result that he and I both want.
John Whittingdale.
My right honourable friend will be aware that estimates of the cost of restoration and rebuilding of Ukraine are now approaching $1 trillion. Can I warmly welcome the suggestion of the Foreign Secretary that we should start using frozen Russian assets of up to $350 billion for that purpose now? And can he say what progress is being made to achieve that?
Mr.
Well, I hope that in due course we will have more to say on the specific provision about which he asks me. He will recall the Ukraine Reconstruction Conference that took place in London last year, where we announced a number of specific measures to lay the foundation for Ukraine's long-term future. And I hope very much that the £250 million of new capital that was announced then, along with the £500 million of a UK loan guarantee via the World Bank, is seen as a down payment on that effort. But in respect of the use of wider funding, he may be sure that his words are being heard.
Stuart Malcolm MacDonald.
For Mr Deputy Speaker, can I back the comments by the honourable gentleman for Exeter? You can back Trump or you can back Ukraine. You cannot do both. And no member of this House should try and ride two horses at once on this conflict. Mr Speaker, I'm probably one of the few members of Parliament who've been to Avdiivka, been to Kramatorsk, been to Sloviansk, going back over 6 years now. And that long line of blood in the loss of Avdiivka 2 weeks ago can be drawn back to two things. One, weapons being held up vis-à-vis what's going on in Washington in Congress. But another frustration that Ukrainians told me about this weekend when I was there with the chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee, and that is the slow yes that they get from Europe. That when Europe and the West decides to provide certain types of capability, it's a slow yes to providing it, and then even slower again, to getting it into Ukraine to be used. That's what will see towns like Kramatorsk go next. So there is a determination to win, quite rightly, but there is an anxiety in that country that in all the times I've been going for 6 or 7 years I haven't experienced. What is the Minister's plan? Not just to keep doing more of what the government's been doing on weapons, which I commend wholeheartedly, but what is the plan to turn the slow yes into a fast yes so that Ukraine can achieve the victory it needs to?
Minister.
Well, in respect to the first part of what he said, he underlines the point which I have repeatedly made today about the importance of the American contribution getting through Congress and arriving in material terms at the front as swiftly as possible. On the second point he made, we are doing everything we possibly can. The Foreign Secretary and the Prime Minister have clearly been in the lead in the support which Europe is giving to Ukraine, and we are seeking to persuade in every way all our friends and allies to do the same. And I would submit to him that in the recent months there has been a very welcome increase in that support from our European allies, and I hope that he will share my pride that the United Kingdom is right at the forefront of those pressing that there is more and better in the future.
Bernard Jenkin.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker, and forgive me if I flee the chamber for a 2 o'clock meeting of the Liaison Committee, which I must attend immediately after this question. But could I point out to my right honourable friend that it was notable how swiftly Number 10 played down President Macron's suggestion that French or NATO troops might be directly deployed to the conflict in the Ukraine. But could this be used to demonstrate how vacillation in Washington will lead to escalation in Europe, and that could the NATO members of European members of NATO also perhaps explore some kind of lend-lease arrangement with the United States, as we had in the 1939-1940 period?
Minister.
Well, may I first of all wish my right honourable friend every success in his outing at the Liaison Committee this afternoon. In what he says, he is right that we need to stretch every sinew in ensuring we give as much support as we possibly can in the way that he suggests. But I must re-echo the words of the NATO Secretary-General Jens Stoltenberg yesterday when he said there are no plans for NATO combat troops on the ground in Ukraine.
Richard Ford.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker, and I would like on behalf of the Liberal Democrats to add to the consensus that Parliament has expressed so far this afternoon in supporting this government statement on Ukraine and the government's position on Ukraine. Sky News reported last week that UK exported equipment may be winding up in Russia, such as drone equipment that has been exported to Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan and Armenia. Exports of heavy machinery to Kyrgyzstan have grown by 1,100% in the last year. What more will the government do to keep dual-use goods from ending up in the occupied oblasts of Ukraine, given that end-user declarations are plainly not sufficient?
Minister.
Well, he's right to... first of all, may I thank the honourable and gallant gentleman for his support, which, as I have said, greatly strengthens the position of the British government, that there is that support across the House. The point he makes underlines the importance of moving sanctions along all the time to take account of things we discover that are happening, clever ways of breaching sanctions, ways of closing down loopholes. And that is very much what we are doing. I mentioned earlier, Mr Deputy Speaker, that we are seeking to introduce powers to sanction individual ships, and we know that companies are involved in circumventing Western sanctions, and we take steps all the time to close down those loopholes, and we will continue to do so.
Mark Pritchard.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. On sanctions and those circumventing sanctions, perhaps through third countries in Central Asia or elsewhere, does the Minister of State believe that the current penalties for breaching sanctions are sufficient? And if not, when the government might bring forward new legislation or take action to increase those penalties, and also to make those that breach sanctions, British companies that are trying to avoid these sanctions, and make it public so that they are shown to have done what they've done in order to send a signal to other people who might be tempted to do the same thing. And finally, Mr Deputy Speaker, on Vladimir Kara-Murza, can I thank the government for taking more action than perhaps it previously has, and thank the Shadow Foreign Secretary and other benches for the cross-party support. There's been talk of a prisoner exchange between the United States government and the Russian government potential. Of course, Vladimir Kara-Murza is a joint British and Russian national, but he was living, and his family still live, in Washington, D.C., worked in Washington, D.C., and I just would encourage and urge, and he doesn't have to make public comments right now, but I hope he will explore the principle of working with the Americans to ensure that Vladimir, should there be any prisoner swap, is part of that exchange.
Mr.
Can I thank him for his comments about Vladimir Kara-Murza? He will know that we have sanctioned 11 individuals, including 2 individuals involved in his earlier poisoning. We don't engage in prisoner exchanges, because that will put a target on the back of so many British citizens if we did, but he may rest assured that we are exploring all possible ways of getting him out. And in respect of his comments about sanctions, sanctions, of course, are designed to close down support for Putin's illegal war machine. And we do prosecute people when they break our laws whenever we can. But as I've mentioned to some of my honourable and right honourable friends and members, we are all the time seeking to ensure that the sanctions regime is as effective and all-engrossing as it can possibly be.
Sammy Wilson.
Mr Deputy Speaker, and can I from our benches also thank the Government for the work which it has done in sending military aid to Ukraine, financial aid, moral and political support, and also the efforts to try and keep some of the less reluctant allies supplying the goods which they have the military equipment they've promised. The recent, and the Minister has given a very upbeat version of the story in Ukraine at the moment, but the fact is that there have been retreats forced upon the Ukrainians because of the weight of Russian military might. Can he tell us what steps is he taking? First of all, to stop those who are inadvertently breaking sanctions, which are helping the Russian military. Secondly, to release funds which are frozen at present, which will be used. And thirdly, to encourage other European countries to get the aid, the military aid, which they've promised, but which has not yet been delivered.
Minister.
Well, first of all, may I thank him and his honourable and right honourable friends for their support for the position of the government. He described my summary of the situation as upbeat. I hope he will accept that it's also candid. I'm trying to paint for the House a picture of what is going on the ground and the steps that the House rightly expects the government to take to forward the endeavour which has brought the House so comprehensively together. On the development of sanctions, as I say, they are becoming increasingly effective and increasingly sophisticated as they bear down on loopholes or ways of getting round them, and that has denied the Russian war machine some $400 billion. That's something like 4 years of running costs for this war, and I hope he will see that that is the result of the painstaking work we, along with our allies, are undertaking to make the sanctions regime as successful and effective as possible.
Kevin Foster.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. Given the position and the look for support internationally and the vital role that plays for Ukraine, it was good to be part of a four-party delegation over the weekend that was in Kyiv, showing our united support from this House for the war effort, which is rightly described not as a war between Ukraine and Russia, but a war between Putin and democracy. And we all know that if Putin wins, Europe will again go down the dark path we went 9 decades ago. So in terms of the support, and I welcome the statement that's been given, particularly if I focus around the issues on drone and the way we've seen drones transforming what happens on the battlefield. What particular discussions are being had, both with looking to enable increased production of drones to be used offensively against Russian forces, but also in terms of technical countermeasures to protect forces that are finding themselves under constant attack?
So can I thank my honourable friend very much for his remarks. In terms of the drone strategy, he will know that my honourable friend here launched this last Thursday. I hope he will agree with me that it is highly effective and just what is required given the importance of drone technology and their effectiveness. And can I thank him very much for being part of the four-party delegation, about which I had heard and which I think is most important, and for the very eloquent way in which he set out why the position that we are taking in what is an existential challenge to our generation, why the action we are taking is so important.
The recent report from Sky News about the sanctions evasion and moving things via Kyrgyzstan, Armenia and Uzbekistan to support Putin's war machine is more often than not, I would suggest, facilitated by professional enablers right here in the UK through the use of shell companies, limited liability partnerships and Scottish limited partnerships. So I've been banging on about this kind of thing for years, yet these loopholes quite evidently still exist and are still being abused. But they come from here, Minister. So can I ask what conversations has the Minister had with Companies House and with HMRC to close those loopholes, to shut down those companies, to go after the people and the professional enablers that sit behind these sanctions evading mechanisms that are being carried out here? And if I may also ask, could he tell me what is being done? Save the Children estimate that 20,000 children have been forcibly removed from their parents in Ukraine and sent to Russia. What diplomatic efforts is the government making to reunite those families?
On her second point, Mr Deputy Speaker, it is absolutely appalling that these very large numbers of children have been taken in the way that she describes. We are in frequent discussions with the International Red Cross to try and make sure that all possible progress is made in respect of their return. In terms of the examples of the technical ways in which sanctions can be evaded, she asks me whether there are conversations going on about closing down those loopholes. And they certainly are. And I think you will see, Mr Deputy Speaker, that at each turn of the ratchet we get more effective in closing down loopholes and stop people evading the sanctions and the will of this House, which is so important in depriving the Putin war machine of the fuel which it needs.
Mr Wyatt.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. My honourable friend rightly highlighted the strengthening of NATO with Finland and Sweden choosing to join since this illegal invasion launched by Putin. And looking ahead to July's NATO summit in Washington, will the government intensify work so that that results in a stronger alliance and more support for Ukraine? Because any other outcome only weakens our collective security.
Yes, he's absolutely right in what he says, and we will do everything we possibly can. But may I just end, Mr Deputy Speaker, by saying that the key steps that we will take will be to strengthen Ukraine in their fight, to ensure Ukraine wins the war if Putin prolongs it, and to lay the foundations for Ukraine's long-term future. We've seen very recently BII, the British government's development finance institution, and the IFC from the World Bank joining together to facilitate trade finance. We saw the $500 million UK loan guarantee via the World Bank. We are determined not only to prosecute in every way we can support for Ukraine in this existential struggle, but also to look to the future and lay these foundations for Ukraine in the longer term. Thank you, Mr Deputy.
I'd like to thank the Minister for his statement today in responding to questions, and Slava Ukraine.